Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. I am Lisette Mendez, Director of Programs for the Miami Book Fair, and I am filling in this evening for my colleagues at Books and Books, our independent booksellers here in Miami. It's my honor to host tonight, but before we get started, I do want to extend our gratitude to tonight's partners, bookstores, two of my favorite bookstores, Harvard Bookstore and Politics and Prose in Washington, D.C. If you've yet to do so, please purchase our featured authors' books from your local independent bookshop. There's a link right on the screen, and you can click through that, and it'll take you to Phil Klay's book. Also, we will have a Q&A period during tonight's program. Please note the ask a question field here at the bottom of the screen and write your questions in there for our author and our moderator. But so I will get this started. Very happy to welcome Phil Klay, even if it's only virtually, to Miami, as he has quite a following here in Miami, having been part of the Miami Book Fair and other programs with Books and Books in the past. He is a veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps and author of Redeployment, which won the 2014 National Book Award for Fiction. Also author of Missionaries, which was named one of the 10 best books of 2020 by the Wall Street Journal. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, and elsewhere. He's currently teaching at Fairfield University, and he is a board member for the arts in the armed forces. Our moderator this evening is Kori, a senior fellow and the director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Before joining the American Enterprise Institute, Dr. Schake was the Deputy Director General of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. She has had a distinguished career in government, working at the U.S. State Department, the U.S. Department of Defense, and the National Security Council at the White House. She has also taught at Stanford University, West Point, Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, National Defense University, and the University of Maryland. And I am going to go ahead and bring them up on our stage right now.
Hello.
Hi, Phil. We're getting a little feedback, but there we go. We're doing good now. Let me go ahead and bring Kori on. Hi,
Hello, Kori.
Kori, Phil. And I'll see you guys later.
Okay. So this is such a privilege. I'm getting a ton of feedback.
Let me see if. Oh dear, this wasn't happening in backstage.
Do you have headphones, Kori, by any chance?
I have them on.
You have on? Okay. Let's see. Let's try again. Phil?
Can you hear me, guys?
Now I can.
Okay.
Hey, there we go. It's fixed. Thank you, Lisette, for saving us. So it is such a joy. There is no contemporary writer whose work I enjoy as much as Phil Klay. And there is no writer of serious literature who is as seriously engaged in the conversation about moral culpability and war. I'm a scholar of civil military relations, and when I teach at Stanford my course Thinking About War, I assign passages from both of Phil's books. So it's a great thrill for me this evening to be able to talk to Phil about this outstanding new collection of books that we're featuring. You can see the cover of Uncertain Ground in its background there. And it's a collection of articles he has published, so nonfiction work about the very serious subject of wars in which the military is running risks and largely separated from the public attitudes about it. And I want to read a passage from one of Phil's essays. 2 decades of war have eroded the morale of America's troops, because he writes in anger that if you think the mission your country keeps sending you on is pointless or impossible, and that you're only deploying to protect your brothers and sisters in arms from danger, then it's not the Taliban or Al Qaeda or ISIS that's trying to kill you. It's America. Phil, talk about that. What raised that anger in you? How are you thinking about the contemporary challenges of ways in which the American government is committing our young men and women into combat?
Yeah, there's another essay in the book where I say joining the military is an act of faith, right? And you're placing your faith in the idea that your country is going to use your life well. And it's just very obvious looking back at the past 2 decades that we haven't actually done that, right? There are periods of more and less responsible military policy. It's not a blanket statement about everything that we've done or repudiation of every way in which we've used the military, but I think it's not just obvious in retrospect, but it was often obvious to troops at the time. I remember talking to a special forces veteran who was talking about the difference between Iraq and Afghanistan deployments at the end of the first decade of the century. And in the public consciousness, Iraq was the dumb war and Afghanistan was a sort of more justified war, right? But
President Obama even called it the good war.
Exactly, right. But the missions that he was doing at the time were very distinct because in Iraq at the time, he was doing raids often, but they were signed off by an Iraqi judge. He could sort of connect how it was related to an attempt to do some sort of nation building and institution building and be related to security gains that he might hope would last. At least that's how he felt at the time. Whereas in Afghanistan, he said, we were going out into the same valleys year after year. We're not doing, building roads or local governments or schools. We don't have the money for that. We're just doing interdiction mission after interdiction mission, getting into these gnarly firefights, oftentimes against kids, right? That the Taliban is sending out. And he said, and we're chewing them up. It's a special forces guy with all the support that SF has and the capabilities that they have and the training that they have. And he said, I used to wonder why they were fighting us, given the losses that they would often take. And I thought, oh, they're doing it because they can, right? And he said everybody kind of knew they were going to come back year after year, and they weren't going to make any long-term gains. And he said it got to be a kind of like almost nihilistic warrior culture, because what are you here for? You're here to fight. And that wasn't what he signed up for, right? Mm-hmm. And so war is the most morally fraught thing that a nation can do. Sending somebody to kill and to risk their life is the most morally fraught thing you can really ask of an American citizen. And particularly at that phase of the war, there were so many people in Afghanistan who didn't believe in the mission, right? I quote one Marine telling a journalist, this war is stupid, so what? Our country's here, right? And yeah, I mean, rage is I think the correct emotion for that circumstance, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
I love that moral culpability is the theme that threads through all of your work. I want to talk a little bit about the moral culpability of broader American society. Mm-hmm. One of the really wonderful essays in the book is on moral risk in the modern military. And one of the things that you write is that we're still mobilized for war, though in a manner perfectly designed to ensure we don't think about it too much. And in that long essay, you do a sort of history of American wars and the relationship the broader society had to it. Talk a little about the moral injury for servicemen and women of disconnection from society. Because I have a friend who's a Gold Star mother, and she told me that the hardest thing about it is that in World War II, everybody knew somebody who had experienced a death in the war. And the hardest thing for her now is nobody has, and so nobody knows how to talk about it with her. And it feels incredibly isolating. And I think that connects to a lot of the themes, not just in your essay on moral risk in the modern military, but how you think about the issues of disconnection.
Yeah, I remember talking to a Marine that I served with who went to college after getting out. And he told me, he said, my experience as a student veteran felt like the lack of an experience. He said, I didn't know any other veterans. I'm surrounded by, 18 or 19-year-old kids, and I don't dislike them, but they tell a story, and it's like, okay, and I tell a story, and sort of, and I'm like, oh, holy shit. And so you stop telling stories, right? Or I know Michael Petrie talks about decoy stories, where he had all these things that he was grappling with, but when people would want to talk to him about his military experience, he'd tell kind of like funny anecdotes that would distract people from dealing with, from sort of actually engaging, right? Which is, partially his fault. But it's also, I think, a sort of natural reaction in a society where you often feel like you're starting at square one, right?
Yeah.
And also where there's so much kind of cultural garbage floating around that you kind of have to navigate through as you're trying to communicate the experience, which you might not necessarily understand yourself, right? Which is why you need to talk about it. And so that there's this thing that's deeply important to you. You're back in the civilian world. You have emerged from a place where you had a sense of community, a sense of purpose, or you rejected that sense of purpose. But even that is a kind of identity. Like the Marine who's like, fuck the Corps, I hate this, I'm a terminal lance. Like, that's a guy. Like, you can be that guy, right?
Yeah.
Everybody knows that guy. And in the civilian world, it doesn't matter that you feel that way. And then on top of that, the experience that you've had, which, look, a lot of people talk about trauma, and that's very real, obviously. But the experience you've had might be built up, might be sort of wrapped around pain, yes. It might be wrapped around pride, deep sort of parts of yourself that you have a complex of emotions about that you haven't necessarily untangled because it's a major life event and you've spent a certain amount of time in a totally different type of society doing things that feel of grave moral importance. And you know that you did them for these people, right? I have friends who, when they were asked, did you kill anyone? They used to say, if I did, you paid me to do it. Right?
Yeah.
Which is a nice way of flipping the question, right? In the sense of culpability. And yet, it doesn't often feel as though there are many people grappling with the questions. When
you have a... Oops, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
When Afghanistan fell, there were a lot of veterans who were involved in the effort to evacuate people. And I remember talking to one veteran whose interpreter had saved his life many times, and his interpreter still had family there. And so he was throwing himself, and still is, into this work to try and get people out to navigate the insane bureaucracy of the system. And he says, I feel like my government didn't fulfill its obligation to these people whose lives are at risk because they work with us. And so that obligation falls on me, right? Which is a very, former soldier thing to think, but that's not a burden he can handle, right? And the work that he's doing day in and day out is extremely intense. You know, people are saying, help me or I might die.
Right.
And sometimes in this work, people do die.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes he has very limited ability to actually help them. And there's a sort of small group of people who are doing this work, but it's not a major political issue. And, you know, people thought that there would be more purchase on this issue with a Democratic administration rather than a Republican one, which had been more hostile towards immigration from Muslim countries. And yet it wasn't particularly good. And so there's this sense of like something morally wounding which is happening, which is people that
Yes.
I feel a real attachment to, an obligation to, and debt to, whose lives are literally at risk, whose situation could be made much better if there was the political will to do relatively small changes.
That's the thing I notice with lots of folks in my circle of acquaintance who were involved in Afghanistan, that this is so little for us to do, and we can't even summon the will to do it. You, in a piece you originally published in the New Yorker, American Purpose After the Fall of Kabul, you quote somebody that really stung for me, in which he says, is the burden of feeling guilty about this also a burden veterans have to carry? Not only did you not care about Afghanistan, not only did you not follow Afghanistan, it's like you gave such a little shit you can't even feel bad yourself. Could somebody else please take some of this, take some responsibility? And I feel like that connects very strongly to what you were just saying, that we are civilian society in the United States because we have made the choice to have a military very small relative to the size of our population, right? That's not the law of gravity. That's a policy choice.
Right.
And we've made policy choices about how we talk about people's service in a way that we tend, as I think you and I both have talked about before, we either treat them as comic book heroes or as, people who had no choice but military service. And both of those are caricatures that free us up from learning how to talk to somebody about their experience and engaging in weaving them back into civilian community.
I want to touch on something that you said, because you were talking about policy choices. And I think it's very easy for this kind of conversation to curdle into a sort of resentment of civilians, right? Which I don't think is healthy. And that same veteran that I quoted in that piece, I talked to him recently, and he's been involved in resettlement things. And one of the things that has been tremendously powerful for him in the months after that is interacting with a lot of other people with no direct connection to Afghanistan or the military, who stepped up and tried to help those Afghans who didn't make it to America. Yeah. And he said to me, he was like, people will step up if you ask them to sometimes. And one of the things that I think is really important is that we have not asked people to, right? And we've made policy choices that have deliberately tried to obscure the wars that we're engaged in, the killing that is done in our name.
Exactly. Again, you have a line in a piece you originally published in the Washington Post that's in the book that was titled, "We Have No Idea What We're Doing in Iraq." You quote
all my titles are so cheery.
The subjects you deal with are so cheery.
There's some jokes in the book.
Yes, actually, that's one of the things that's lovely about your work, the funniness of it, right? Like a line actually from a very serious piece you wrote about how deployment to Iraq changed your view of God. You have this fabulous line about how fiction thrives on sick sheep and ball sweat. Would you like to explain that to listeners?
So, yeah, I'm going to have to take a step back to explain that. So, Yeah, I came back from Iraq, and when I was in, violence had just kind of dropped off a cliff in Anbar province. It was during the surge. So you had the surge alongside the Anbar awakening. And I think those two components, and I won't get into the debates about it, were important for this sort of decline in violence that you saw at the time. So we left feeling really, really good about what we had done, what we had been a part of. And, units who had left early 2007, a lot of them left feeling just really negatively about the whole mission because they'd been there through late 2006 and horrible violence and never seen anything get better. And then the units that came in and replaced them, it was like, oh, we're actually making things better. This could work. And so I came back from Iraq with a lot of very firm convictions about what I'd been a part of, what it meant, what the right course was. But I was also, a fiction writer. And when you're writing fiction, you have all these, wonderful ideas that you think you believe, but you have to actually put it into concrete people. So along with those ideas about the war, I had these sort of memories, right? Unquiet memories. And some of them were about things that, you might be more obviously relevant for a story, right? Like the time when mortuary affairs specialists, guys who prepare the bodies of the dead, was talking to my sergeant about the horrible burn case, right, that they dealt with, and the experience of sort of prying this fallen Marine's hands open to find out what he was clutching onto as he died.
Which I think you do write about in one of the stories of redeployment.
Yes. Yeah, that's where that story came from. And at the same time, there's just like seeing a shepherd with the most amazingly sick sheep with just incredible gobbets of snot coming from every sheep's nose. I'd never seen anything like it. It was incredible. And yes, ball sweat. Okay. And, like all of those, the little textures are really important, right? And when you're paying attention to the texture of life, right? Flannery O'Connor says that fiction writers are much more interested on putting slippers on clerks than sort of grand ideas, referring to a Flaubert sentence.
Yeah.
It undermines all the things that you thought you knew. And all of a sudden, everything gets more fuzzy. It gets more morally complicated. It gets more human, right? There's a great John Renahan essay where he talks about encountering actually Stanford students who were lovely, but in some of the lines of questioning, he saw sort of what he refers to as the prim moral style of the ideologue, right?
Great phrase.
Yeah, it's a great phrase. And you just can't do that in fiction because it doesn't work. It doesn't create real characters because people aren't neat abstractions. So the critical ingredient of fiction, sick sheep and ball sweat.
There we go. So my favorite of all of your writing, my favorite is one of the stories in Redeployment called Psychological Operations, about a veteran who's going to college, a college where clearly he's anomalous, and a young woman he takes an interest in. And they have an argument about Islam, and which feels to him a religion of violence and feels to her a religion of the book. And she
She's a
goes
convert.
She goes to the ombudsman, says she felt intimidated. And he, in the meeting with the ombudsman, he consciously plays the PTSD card because he knows that's going to get him out of the trouble he's gotten himself into. And do you mind if I tell the end of the story?
Go for it, yeah.
Because I love it so much. They come out of the meeting and she's apologetic. And he wheels around on her and says, what if the big bad war didn't make me an asshole? What if I'm just an asshole? And it's so powerful because he's trying to say, that's not all I am. even as he has just used so manipulatively
Right.
his identity as a veteran to get himself out of trouble. And every time I read that, I wonder if anyone who wasn't a veteran would have written that story. Maybe even could have written that story. How do you feel about veterans' identity in writing? Because it comes through so clearly there, but also you play with the manipulativeness of that identity more nimbly than anybody else does.
I love it when civilians write military characters. I mean, when they do it well, right? But I love it when vets do it well, and I don't like it when they do it poorly. I think that if you're a veteran writing about veterans, you're better able to get away with some BS, right? I think we're both probably familiar with some memoirs that were, like, did that happen? I think that happened.
Yeah.
And
I very often think about Tim O'Brien's line about there's no such thing as a true war story.
Right. And some of the great stories, written by people whose relationship to the war is at some degree of remove, right? I mean, Hemingway was an ambulance driver. Stephen Crane famously, Top Gun, right? I mean, the Pugilist at Rest. And he spent time in the military, but he was not a Vietnam vet. So I think you get away with certain things, and in that story, maybe veterans are giving me more credit. That's not purely a sort of an attack, but that I'm genuinely interested in the ways in which sort of there's this thing which is the public perception of the veteran. If you're a smart guy and the narrator of that story is a smart guy and kind of an asshole, you can manipulate, right? And he was a psychological operations, specialist, so he's very familiar with words as tools, words but I mean, you see that there's an essay in the book about Eric Greitens and how nimbly he manipulated the sort of image of the SEAL, whether he was talking to Harvard and presenting himself in this very polished, hand in the fist, heart in the fist leadership way, or whether he was, adopting a more rugged persona for partisan politics. And you even see it in something like, I'm often fascinated by the fact that a guy like Chris Kyle, and SEALs that I know who worked with him said that he was, he was a real warrior. Somehow, despite the fact that this was a guy who had every war story in the world, felt the need to fabricate sort of ridiculous, sort of like ready for Hollywood stories about, shooting bandits on a Texas highway, because I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier about Paul Sweat and Sick Sheep, that the specificity of real stories don't have the kind of clean, heroic lines that he wanted in that sense, and that I think his audience wanted.
Yeah.
And so you're conscious as a veteran of the images that people have that you can consciously choose to play into. And of course, there's a sort of broken veteran on the other side, right? I told a story about, I told a story about Iraq at a storytelling contest in New York, and this woman just starts like rubbing my back afterwards, like I'm a startled horse in a thunderstorm, and she's like, "You're so brave to tell that story." And
So I have a ton more questions that I wish I could ask you, but we also have a list of questions that people have written in to ask, and I want to start with those. The first is, as a veteran, Vietnam era, how would today's conversation about war be different if the draft were to return? And related, how does the drafted veteran communicate with the veteran active duty soldier when their worlds differ so radically?
Yeah. Oh, before I get into answering that question, I forgot to say something. I want to thank the Miami Book Festival, thank Books and Books, the Harvard Bookstore, Politics and Prose, and to urge people, please, even if everything that I've said is nonsense and you're like, I'm not reading a word, that guy wrote. I'm not even going to read his title if I see it in front of me. There's other books that you could buy from these fine bookstores if you click on the links. Safe passage, perhaps, from the wonderful
Thank you,
Kori
my
Schake.
friend.
But yes, please do support these fantastic bookstores. I think that the draft is a question that I go back and forth on. I don't think, sometimes people talk about it as a kind of cure-all, and I don't actually think that it would be, particularly not because of the way that we're using the military right now. You know, if you read accounts of the soldiers in Vietnam prior to the large troop presence, where they're working with local forces, doing a supervised train and assist type mission in some ways, right? There's their comments about the war and their alienation from the society back home are not that dissimilar, right? And it's not like there's much political will to have a large troop presence anywhere right now. So if you had a draft, I don't think it would necessarily translate into, you know, more people having direct experience with war, right? You know, there's a great David Halberstam New York Times piece from the 1960s, early 1960s, where he's talking to people about how it feels like they're in a private war, where it feels like it's your war, but not your country's war. And I think in many ways that's the situation for a lot of troops right now. We have a pretty expansive presence, but it's light, and we don't talk about it much. We don't embed reporters. And a lot of what is done is secret. So would a draft change things in that regard? No, I don't think it would. I don't think that we're going back to a draft anyway. I don't think the military really wants to go to a draft. Kori Schake is nodding her head, and I trust her opinion more than my own. But you want people who actually want to be there. I mean, like, there are plenty of knuckleheads as it is.
The genius of the all-volunteer force is that it aligns the people most willing to run these risks with the risks.
Yeah.
And so you have far fewer problems of discipline, of people wounding themselves to get out of service. If you look at the difference between the Ukrainian military and the Russian military right now, the Russian military is conscripted, it's brutal, and they have soldiers killing officers, they have desertions on large scale, they have people destroying their own equipment. The Ukrainian military has ballet dancers and transgender hairstylists, but what they also have is an ardent belief that if you're willing to serve your country, you belong here. And that creates an ethos of connectivity, not just among the troops, but also between them and the society, that strongly strengthens morale. I want to ask you one question related
Can I
to
say
something.
one more thing related to that?
Yes, go ahead.
I do very much believe in national service. And I think that there should be more avenues for young people to serve, and more encouragement and more of an expectation that you do some sort of service where you're thrown together with Americans who you wouldn't meet in other avenues. You know, like, I met America when I joined the Marine Corps because I lived in a bubble my whole life, right? I mean, we all do. And then all of a sudden you're like, you got everybody, children of Vietnamese immigrants from like Iowa, the kid who grew up on a compound with a lot of AK-47s in South Carolina, and in case Armageddon comes, just the whole range of Americans, and all kind of tied together for a common goal. And I think that's really wonderful, right? I tell a story of going to a wedding in Pennsylvania, in rural Pennsylvania, and we're driving down. There's like 19 Trump digs coal signs, and my wife is Colombian American. She sort of like looks at these signs, and she's like, "Am I going to be the only Hispanic person at this wedding?" I was like, no, it's a military wedding. It's going to be super diverse, right? You had everybody there, right? Which is exactly what I expected. So I think that not everybody wants to be in the military, should be in the military. And I don't think that it will solve the political problems that we have. But I do think that national service is something important. I think it's ennobling. I think it's instructive. I think it's good.
You write a lot about committing to something bigger than yourself.
Yeah.
And it always resonates for me since I worked for John McCain, and he said the same thing. So I have a policy question to ask you, because you wrote in your terrific New Yorker piece that's reprised in the book about American purpose after the fall of Kabul, that what a lot of veterans want is a sense of serious engagement with the wars.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's right. I think that gets the fundamental truth. What does that look like for you? What should it have looked like when the Biden administration was making decisions about the withdrawal from Afghanistan? What should it look like as we contemplate the war in Ukraine and the proxy war we are fighting in Ukraine?
Yeah. One of the threads through the book is the authorization for the use of military force, and I don't want to rest too much on that. But I do think we have a situation where presidents are not held accountable for war policy, for advocating for it, debating it in public, justifying it. I would like to have a situation where if we're going to have troops in harm's way, if we're going to be killing people on a regular basis, that every 2 years the president should have to go before Congress, explain what the mission is, what it's going to cost, what the benchmarks of success might be, so that we would know in 2 years whether or not we've met them. And then I think every member of Congress should have to vote on that, right? And that's not going to give you good policy necessarily. But for one thing, it will articulate to the troops in the field what they're supposed to be doing and why, right? Which is something that I knew in 2007 when I was in Iraq. It was hotly debated, and in many ways it was a circus. I don't know if you recall when General Petraeus came to testify before Congress with Ryan Crocker, and MoveOn.org took out a full-page ad in the New York Times saying that he was going to be General Petraeus cooking the books for the White House, and there's all kinds of grandstanding. And like there was a little bit of a political circus and partisan insanity. There was democracy in action, in other words. And that's good.
I have the exact same reaction, Phil, that the only thing that civil military relations cannot withstand in the United States is apathy.
Yeah.
Right? Any manner of fair or unfair attacks are actual democracy in practice and are an opportunity to create the connections. I've been doing some research on veteran involvement in the January 6th insurrection, because the news coverage makes it sound as though there's an overwhelming number of veterans, and it's actually not true. The representation is equivalent to the representation of males who've had military service in the U.S. But two things drove the coverage in a different direction. The first, military service records are searchable. You can tell if somebody's been in military service. And second, the journalists reporting on January 6th weren't defense reporters. They were political reporters. And so they didn't have the context of understanding the culture of the military and being able to translate it. So it makes a huge difference on a very important public policy problem, which is the American military a threat to democracy in our country? And that gap between civilian knowledge and the military experience has led us to a misleading conversation about military involvement. So 2 more quick questions from questioners in our last few minutes that I want to read to you, because they both have to do. So the first is, why has the government made these policy choices about the size of our troops when we spend so much money on the military? And then a paired question is about, is it true that the resources for returning soldiers aren't adequate to address the issues the soldiers are experiencing?
Why has the government made these policy choices about the size of our troops when we spend so much money on the military? I'm not sure.
So I'll take a stab at that if you like.
Okay.
Which is that our people are the most expensive thing in the American defense budget. Yeah. And so, as with manufacturing in America, we have automated a whole bunch of the tasks that military forces used to undertake, and we've also outsourced a bunch of them. So soldiers don't peel potatoes anymore, contractors peel potatoes. And so those policy choices about the expense of the people and about not wanting to put people at risk, right? The advance of drones instead of manned aviation for the same reason have driven those choices. They weren't choices necessarily about the size of the force you need for the war. So Phil Klay, I have one last question to ask you, my friend. I think we are living through a renaissance of veteran writers, right? So much good work being done by Elliot Ackerman, Matt Gallagher.
His new book is right behind me.
Outstanding. Who else should we be reading to understand, to bridge this gap that you describe so beautifully as an abrogation of responsibility if we civilians don't try and understand war and veterans don't try to explain it to us? Who besides you, Phil Klay, should we be reading? And Elliot Ackerman and Matt Gallagher.
Yeah, Elliot Ackerman and Matt Gallagher are fantastic writers and good friends. Elliot was just in, actually both Elliot and Matt were just in Ukraine and had some really interesting writing from there. Dwayne Faria, I think, is fantastic. There's a phenomenal memoir by a woman named Ryan Lee Dostie called Formation that I thought was tremendously powerful. There's an anthology called The Road Ahead that Brian Kastner and Adrian Bonnenberg put out.
So good.
It's really good, really, and there's a real range of stories that, I just strongly recommend. There are sites out there like the Wrath-Bearing Tree or the War Horse where they're veteran writing that you can find. I think there's a really tremendous range of veteran fiction. Syracuse University puts out a veteran fiction prize every year. Mm-hmm. So check that out. I judged it this year, so
that's great.
The winners can be very good. I don't think we lack for good writers about the current situation, which is great, and who knows what the future is going to produce. I'm very interested in some of them. So.
Also, great poetry being written. Wrath-Bearing Tree publishes a lot of really good poetry.
Yeah, some phenomenal humor, and Graham Barnhart has a phenomenal collection called The War Makes Everyone Lonely.
Yeah. So we are out of time, my friends. I want to thank Books and Books in Miami, Politics and Prose in DC, and the Harvard Bookstore in Boston for giving me the privilege of a really fun conversation with the good and great Phil Klay, whose new book you ought to run out and get, his old books you ought to run out and get. Read them every opportunity you can. You will be wiser, and you will also laugh about shit with snot and ball sweat, my friends.
I think that's probably the best ending I've heard of any conversation I've hosted. Thank you both so much. Phil, I think you were saying something, I interrupted.
Oh, just really grateful. Thank you, Kori. Get some rest because you're overseas right now. But incredibly grateful for you guys having me and for you doing this with me, Kori. It's a real privilege.
Well, thank you so much. And everyone who's out there watching and listening, thank you for being here tonight. There's a link to purchase the book. I tried to drop as many links to the books that Phil mentioned and Kori mentioned on the side. But we hope to get Phil back here in Miami this November for the Miami Book Fair. And Kori, you're also invited, of course, if you're
Thank you.
interested in spending a couple of days of winter in Miami. Thanks again, and have a great evening. See you all at the next event. Good night.
Good night.